Hi there, everybody. I hope everyone is doing great. As you watch this video, this one is about staying neutral, and it dovetails pretty nicely with what we talked about last week, which was academic tone. We're going to continue that conversation here because in this week, this is sort of the transition period between research and writing, where now we are ready to begin drafting. And you've submitted the working bibliography, which shows me that you have gathered great sources and you've annotated them. So now that you've looked through the good material that you've gathered, now you're ready to start organizing it and also begin the drafting phase. And one of the challenges that a lot of students encounter as they begin to work, particularly on the IRP assignment, is the challenge of staying neutral, the challenge of writing without using first person, using academic tone, and also staying focused on the informative approach that's required in the assignment instead of moving toward an argumentative or persuasive stance. And this is probably one of the greatest challenges of this assignment, because it's important for you as a student to write about what you care about, write about something that appeals to you. And that probably means that you've chosen a topic on which you have perhaps some really strong opinions. And it's important that we keep those at bay as we focus on an informative style here. You'll definitely get your chance to unleash the powers of persuasion and some persuasive and argumentative rhetoric for our second research paper. But here it can be really tricky to be mindful of tone and to stay objective as you write. So that's the focus of this week's lecture on staying neutral. So we'll start with the discussion of objective tone versus subjective tone. So if you know what objectivity and subjectivity are, and you can apply that to tone pretty easily. So when we talk about objective tone, what we mean is an impersonal style of writing. And I hate that the word impersonal has such a connotation of negativity, that when we say something is impersonal, that means that it's cold, that it's distant, that it's unfeeling, and we mean all of those things in a negative way. I wouldn't really consider an impersonal style of writing to be necessarily a bad one. We talked last week when we discussed academic tone that academic tone doesn't have to be blah, blah, blah. It doesn't have to sound like the teacher from Charlie Brown. It really can have flavor and style and really be engaging and clever, but it is an impersonal style of writing. And when we use objective tone, we're focusing on giving information to our reader without revealing a whole lot about ourselves. And so in that way, we kind of think about objective tone as maintaining some omniscience. We're kind of floating above as the writer. We're trying not to be center stage. It's not about us. It's not about what we think, what we feel, what we recommend. When we try to use an informative stance and style in our writing, we're really wanting to let the research do the heavy lifting for us. It's not for us to say, I believe this, I want you to do that, I want you to take this action. In the informative stance, what we're doing is allowing the research to sort of guide our audience in a less direct way. It's fair to say that really all writing, even academic writing, even research writing, even informational writing, has some air of persuasion to it. It's not possible to always keep that under wraps, but when we choose objective tone over subjective tone, we have a lot more control, and we have a lot more control in keeping our own personal stance on things better hidden. And that's sort of the goal that we can hope for. It's not really realistic. I don't want to undo your opinion or your strong feelings about a topic. I just want you to sort of keep them covered up, keep them disguised well, so that your reader, your audience, can walk away feeling like you have approached the topic in a balanced, fair, and objective way. So let's compare that objective tone that we've been talking about so far with subjective tone. So subjective tone, it really reflects about the writer directly. It tells us what the writer thinks, feels, believes. It really is incorporating the writer in the discussion in a direct way. That's what happens when we use subjective tone. So you can understand why it's important when our goal is to inform a reader, inform an audience, why objectivity is preferable to subjectivity. So I have 6 different sentences, and they are a blend of objective and subjective sentences. And so let's go through these and just see if we can identify which ones are objective. So we have the first: John F. Kennedy was the greatest American president. So take a minute and just think about whether you believe that is objectively phrased or subjectively phrased. And the answer is subjective. So there we are revealing something about the writer. The writer believes that John F. Kennedy was the greatest American president. That's an opinion, that's an assertion made by the writer. On to number 2, healthy adult cats weigh on average between 8 and 14 pounds. And this is an objective statement. So we're making a proclamation of fact. We are attributing that knowledge. Likely that came from a source which we would be citing, but that is an objective statement. On to the third sentence: fruit trees grow best in warm climates, zone 8B through 10. There's another objective statement there. So you can see how that sentence is anchored in factual information. If we had said something like, I think fruit trees grow best in warm climates, then that would be a subjective phrase. But the way that we see the phrasing here is objective. On to number 4. The public refused to invest in a recycling program despite its clear benefits. And this one is a little trickier because the first part of the sentence, that first phrase, the public refused to invest in a recycling program, that's a factual statement. It becomes subjective when we see what follows that comma, despite its clear benefits. So there's an opinion there that there were benefits to this recycling program that were overlooked by the public. And particularly that adjective clear benefits sort of lifts up the curtain and shows us what the writer is thinking and what the writer believes in a direct way. So that's something to be careful about. So we have something that's potentially objective, but based on where we steer that sentence following that comma, it does become subjective. So on to number 5. The film was highly acclaimed by critics as an outstanding documentary. And again, this is objective, but I'm seeing a lot of adjectives that make me think that this might be a little bit dramatic in terms of language. However, it depends on what bookends this. Are we talking about specific critical reviews? Are we using that as source material? Are those people saying things that really do qualify their reviews as highly acclaiming this film and calling it an outstanding documentary? We're warned against using that kind of superlative language in order to maintain academic tone. If we really have source material that substantiates this, then yeah, this would be objective. If we don't, and we're just sort of making this claim without backing it up and bolstering ourselves with source material, then it might kind of lean towards subjectivity. Finally, we have crocheting is a safe and relaxing activity that everyone should try. And here we have a clearly subjective. We have sort of a directive from the reader. And whenever we have the reader saying that we should do something, we should believe something, we should take some form of action, that is clearly a persuasive tactic, and that moves us away from academic tone. So here, our sentence about crocheting is a subjective one. All right, moving on. So we've established pretty well that objective tone should be equated with academic tone. When we are speaking and writing objectively, we are generally following the guidelines of academic tone, which we talked about last week. So some of this is repetitive, but it is just sort of a good reminder, a good refresher to connect us with last week's lecture. So when we are chasing objective tone, we really want to model that well in our writing. We should avoid first person, using words like I, I, me, and my. And also these evaluative words. So we talked on the last slide about sort of dramatic language and superlative words, words that have some connotations of feelings or emotions. Words like terrible, wonderful, awful, amazing, things like that. They can carry some emotional weight. And so to remain objective, sometimes we might choose different words that are less evaluative. So just keep those things in mind. And now we have some adventures in rephrasing. So all of these are subjective statements. And this is a good exercise because you'll catch yourself writing in a subjective way. And that doesn't mean that you can't use what you've written. In many cases, let's say you slip into first person even, there are ways that you can rephrase what you have written to get it back in sync with academic tone and to maintain objective tone. So really, it doesn't mean that if you've fallen out of that pattern that you have to scrap or delete everything that you have drafted. You really can go back and make adjustments, and sometimes they're quite subtle. So we're going to walk through a number of examples on this slide and a few slides that follow. So, and these are ones that I think students would realistically include in a draft. And that's not to say that these are terrible. I want this exercise to be fruitful and that realistically, these are things that we see that stray from objectivity, but can easily sort of be channeled back to meet the challenge of the assignment. So the first sentence, Americans should never forget the tragedy that occurred on September 11th, 2001. And you can see where if this were a research essay that you were writing on 9/11, on terrorist attacks, this could be something that might even be featured in an opening paragraph. It is subjective. And so in order to rephrase it, we could say something like, Americans are not likely to ever forget the tragedy that occurred on September 11th, 2001. So really, linguistically, not a whole lot that we've changed there, but we've taken that direct order. I mean, we've really phrased the original sentence is phrased as a command. Americans should never forget. You should never forget this. You're telling your reader that they should believe something, they should do something, they should take some form of action. And all of those things are persuasive. And so really just subtle changes, instead of saying, I believe that Americans should never forget, we could just sort of gently rephrase to say, it's unlikely that Americans will ever forget the tragic events that occurred on September 11th, 2001. We might also key into words like tragic, but I think that given an event like September 11th and the readers that are likely to be gathered in your audience, tragedy to refer to that event is probably not something that would be dramatic or overstated, but it is something to be on the lookout for, those sort of words that are emotionally loaded. Okay, on to the next. Here's a more fun one, some levity after we've talked about September 11th. While marching bands collaborate to dazzle crowds, the talents and efforts of the solo baton twirler are often overlooked and underestimated. Okay, so let's say that you are a really enthusiastic, talented baton twirler, and this is all about the song of the baton twirler and illuminating their struggle, because readers give all of the credit to marching bands when they perform at halftime, and athletes who are really impressing everyone, and that's what draws fans in the first place. But you have the baton twirler, who's just a one person, generally a one-woman show. And so this is your sort of manifesto about being overlooked and underestimated. So we see some loaded language here. As we reread the sentence, we see words like overlooked and underestimated, dazzling crowds. To move us back toward objectivity, we might just soften the language a little bit here. And make it seem less connected directly to the writer. So, on to the third sentence. Everyone agrees that dogs are indeed man's best friend. Okay, one of the problems here is that we see opinion, and we also see a person's opinion that would be pretty easy to dispel. does everyone really believe that dogs are man's best friends? So we have to be careful about these words like everyone, everybody, always, never. When we use those words, it's really easy to just sort of knock over those assertions, because all we have to do is find one caveat to that, and then we've really cheapened our credibility by that phrasing. So you could soften the phrasing to many people subscribe to the phrase that dogs are indeed man's best friend, but softening away from that everyone would be a good way to make a return to objective tone. All right, continuing on, a sentence stating consumers should invest the effort to make their homes more energy efficient, which will yield benefits to both the planet and pocketbooks. So again, we have a directive. This is phrased, though gently, as a command. You should invest the effort in making your home more energy efficient, is the subtext here. And so what we could do to move us back toward objective tone would be to say something like, many experts suggest that consumers should invest the effort to make their homes more energy efficient, blah, 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 blah. So instead of making that a suggestion directly from us, we could attribute that to experts. We could attribute that to studies have shown that the investment that consumers make in their homes toward energy efficiency yield benefits to both the planet and pocketbook. So we have to find a way to rephrase this that makes what we're saying factual and not opinionated. Now we have another phrase, another sentence. Dr. Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech is easily the best of all speeches to come from the 1960s civil rights movement. So again, we have best of all speeches. So we're making a proclamation. We're really making an argument here. The phrasing is argumentative and not informative. So again, we want to take the reflection that directs the reader to think about the writer and the writer's perspective. The writer comes through pretty clearly here. The writer believes that the "I Have a Dream" speech is the best of all speeches from the civil rights movement. And maybe many people would believe this. Maybe most people would believe this. But the phrasing is still problematic in terms of not being as objective as it should be, particularly for an informative writing. And so, again, we might rephrase by projecting that onto the general public. The general public believes that King's "I Have a Dream" speech is one of the best speeches to come from the 1960s, or the public generally remembers King's "I Have a Dream" speech as one of the most effective to come from the 1960s civil rights movement. So again, we don't have to make huge changes to this, but we have to phrase it so that it comes across as a factual statement. All right. Stopping here to let you know that the code word for this week, when you go to complete the VVQ before Saturday evening, is flowers, F-L-O-W-E-R-S, flowers. Don't forget that S. It's not one singular flower, it's flowers plural, F-L-O-W-E-R-S. And rounding third, we're nearly finished with this lecture. Just a few more of these activities and a final slide to conclude. So now we have the sentence, parents must take the time to educate themselves on the risks of not vaccinating their children before deciding against it. So we have again phrased this sentence as a command. You should take the time to educate yourself on not vaccinating your children before you decide not to do that. So it's a command. You're wanting your reader to take some action. To educate themselves would be that action that's recommended by the author here. And so what we can do is rephrase to make it a factual statement. Many physicians encourage parents to take the time to educate themselves on the risks of not vaccinating their children before parents decide against it. So instead of making that our words, we attribute those words to someone else. And when we do that, it's always preferable for us to make that person who is speaking on our behalf and sort of we're puppeteering our opinion through them, it's important that they be an expert. Moving on to this last statement. As an adult diagnosed with ADD, I think that many people characterize us incorrectly and unfairly as being easily distracted, fidgety, and having a tendency to procrastinate. So, okay, the thing that probably jumped out here as you're reading this is the use of first person, I think. And when we see a phrase like, as an adult diagnosed with ADD, the reader's making a direct reference to themselves, which really sort of goes against the grain of academic tone and academic writing. And it's certainly not objective. Now we've clearly crossed into subjective language. Now that doesn't mean that we have to can everything that's in this sentence here. So we have experts who have researched adults diagnosed with ADD often find that they are mischaracterized as being easily distracted, fidgety, and having a tendency to procrastinate. See, so we've taken the I out of that and we've projected our opinion through an expert. Now, the challenge is you can't just say that an expert says that. You have to go out and find source material that actually substantiates what you are trying to say, and that's part of the thrill of research and source use. So if you've collected good sources, chances are you won't have a huge struggle finding a quote or something that you can summarize or paraphrase that really corroborates this subtle argument that you're making throughout an informative writing. Okay, so finishing up here, we have tips for maintaining objectivity. And this is just advice from someone who loves to insert opinion into her own writing. I struggle with this, and because I use academic tone a lot, these are things that I have learned to rely on. The first thing is, if you want to remain objective in your writing, have a plan for that writing. Sometimes folks like to outline. And if you've taken high school writing classes, you're likely to have been encouraged to create outlines prior to just opening up a Word document and beginning your typing adventures. I would encourage you to have a plan. Now, outlines don't work for everyone. Some people like free writing, some people like mind mapping, but do have a plan, and specifically make sure that you are really familiar with your research. It's really hard to be objective if you aren't really familiar with what experts have to say, because those are your buddies. When you can't use first person, you're really going to have to puppeteer your opinion, your thoughts, what you think is important for the reader to have in front of them to be educated on your subject. You really have to work through the research. And so if you aren't familiar with it, you're going to be more limited in your ability to do that. So that's my first and probably most emphatic recommendation, is to have a plan for your writing. Don't just start typing. And also, I think a sub-reference for this, a smaller piece of advice connected with it is, don't leave yourself so little time to complete your draft that you must begin writing without a plan. So if you have 2 sections of a draft that are due at midnight, don't start working on that at 10 p.m. Pick at it. Work at really becoming familiar with your research so that you aren't pressed for time and you have no choice but to begin that writing without a plan. It will definitely show in your draft. So moving on to other points, let the research make the point for you. You know, you can't say, I think it's stupid that people do this. I think it's ridiculous that people text and drive. I think it's awful that mental health facilities have become so dilapidated and unavailable to a deserving public. Whatever. The research can make the point for you, because you're not at liberty to use first-person perspective in academic writing. So this is where having good sources gives you some real strength. It gives you some real tools that you can use and still maintain objective and academic tone. Also, let an expert make the point for you. So we've looked at this through these activities, these example sentences. If you can't use I, and if you can't make that opinion, if it's something that you're wanting to get the reader to do or think or feel or believe, let an expert say that. They can do that in their writing, and you are just sort of providing that as evidence, which is factual, which is informative. So those are 2 options. Let the research make that point, let an expert make that point. And that's why having good research and having credible sources makes it easier to do that. And then also keep in mind that we should write differently than we speak. And so if you are preparing to write a research paper, one of the struggles will be to phrase something in the way that is appropriate for writing and not speaking. And that doesn't mean that you can't ever write anything in a draft that is a little informal. What you might find is that if this is your first rodeo with academic tone, if this is the first research paper that you've ever written or the first one that you've written in a long, long time, you might try to write it as you would say it, right, as though you're speaking, but then you will have to go back and really comb through it to shift the tone that you're using for speech and make it less conversational, less informal, and you'll have to sort of cinch it in to make it more objective. Now, that's something that you can do so long as you remain mindful that we have to write differently than we speak. It's important for our reader. Our reader can't follow us when we write as though we are speaking. It doesn't read the same way. It's really easy to confuse a reader when you are typing in the same way that you would speak casually in conversation. But if you begin that way, as long as you are editing and revising to make the reader's experience more clear, and you are maintaining that objectivity, or at least moving toward that as you continue to refine the draft, then that's fine. But it is something that you must be mindful of. So that is all about finding that, that neutral voice. And if you have questions, as always, I welcome your emails. I welcome your phone calls. Just let me know. This is, again, just an extension of academic tone that we've talked about last week. So keep up the great work in class. I'm really looking forward to reading the 2 draft sections of your IRP. If you need help as you get started, your discussion board group members for week 6 will have good things for you to think about. And of course, I am always an available resource. So have a good one, everybody. Thanks for watching this.